over to you, Christina.
Thank you very much for having us. So I'm just going to do a little intro to the research centre, which led on this research, and then Catherine's going to actually give you all the details. Catherine and I were involved in this research, but we should also mention Caroline Fairfruth, who was also involved. So Catherine, if you go to the next slide. So the research is part of the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations, or CAST, which is based at the University of Bath. We sort of have this broad question which we ask ourselves: how can we as a society live differently and better to achieve systemic, deep and rapid emission reductions? We work across mostly 4 areas, although it's expanding. So food, heating and cooling, transport and also material consumption. And various researchers in the centre are working across scales. So today we're going to be talking more about sort of individual community level, but we also have people working at organisational, city and more national, international levels. Catherine, next slide. This is just also to say we've been funded by a major UK funder for 5 years, and we've just moved into the second phase. There's lots of other universities, including Manchester, Cardiff, and UEA involved, and lots of other partners. So do please go on our website and have a look if you're interested. Catherine, next slide. This is just an overview of the key themes that we've got. This was phase 1. We're sort of replicating this in phase 2, but we're presenting research today that was part of the first theme, which is the visioning theme, where we ask ourselves, what could low carbon transformed futures look like? And we worked with people from multiple countries to develop kind of visions for low carbon futures. But there was also a large scale survey. We're tracking discourse changes, media representations, and so on. We had a second theme, which is all about looking at how and why transformations have occurred in the past. We had a trialing theme where we looked at how we can accelerate different transformations at different scales. So we were trying to make changes in the real world and learning about how what works and what doesn't work. And then we have an engaging theme, which is about how we can embed what we find in society. Next slide, Catherine. And just some examples of the kinds of engagement that we do across with different stakeholders. So we've had researchers on policy secondments and charity placements. We had a seed corn fund to partner with different organizations. We write lots of policy briefs and do presentations like this. We have a data portal and so on. So there's lots of different things, and our website is continuously being updated. It's quite full of things now. So do have a look if you're interested. Catherine, if you click next, I think the report will come up. Yeah. So last year we published sort of a synthesis of our key messages from the first 5 years. So I just wanted to plug this report, which also you can find online, which kind of summarizes everything that we've learned over the last 5 years about putting people at the heart of climate transformations, which is our main mission. And then next slide, Catherine. Yeah. So today we're going to be presenting some work that was part of theme 1, as I already mentioned. And we were interested in understanding what feasible but also desirable pathways there are for achieving climate change targets and also other sustainability goals, and how these kinds of visions and pathways vary within the UK, but also other countries. So I think Catherine will talk about this, but the analysis we're presenting today was mostly based on the UK, but we have also done work in Sweden and China and a little bit in Brazil. So there's a kind of a survey that we've done, and there's a data portal which you can have a look at if you scan the barcode, which is quantitative data. But then Catherine is going to present on our qualitative work that we've done across countries, mostly focusing on the UK today. But there's also a report where we summarize the qualitative work that we've done across countries. So do please have a look at that. But what we're presenting today has also been published as an, I think, open access paper. So if you're inclined to read an academic paper, do please go and have a look at that as well. Otherwise, Catherine, take it away.
Great, thanks, Christina. Okay, yeah, hi everyone. It's really great to be here with you to share our work with you today. Yeah, as Christina mentioned, I led on the qualitative part of the visioning research that we conducted in the UK, and this was while I was at Cardiff University, but I've since moved to Edinburgh. But so I can probably just launch straight in. So it was a 4-year project conducted in the UK. We also did similar workshops in China and Sweden, and our colleague Caro led on this. which we're hoping to publish soon. But today I'll just be talking about the UK data and give you an overview of the paper and our findings and how these discourses of climate inaction were undermining public support for climate action. So I've got just a very brief overview of the methods, and then I'll talk a bit about the visions that the participants created, which are the ones that you can see in this social visioning report that is available online. So following the cast as a whole, the purpose of the project was really to explore how we can live differently and better while still kind of achieving urgently needed emissions reductions. But in this case, specifically focusing on publics and how they could imagine what this desirable, but also at least relatively radical low carbon future might look like. And obviously we did this work in 2021. And so it was before all the sort of announcements that we might have already breached 1.5 degrees warming. But regardless of the exact targets, we know that if we want to reduce warming to as low as possible, and we know that technology on its own is not enough to achieve this, then we know we need to see some kind of significant cuts to emissions associated with everyday lives in some way. And we know from CAST survey work that theoretically, at least, the UK public is very positive about climate action and many different net zero policies. But what's not really clear is whether people understand to what extent these policies and technologies might actually impact on their everyday life and how they feel about that. So while there's kind of lots of competing visions of the future out there, these are usually created by technical or policy experts. They're often quite kind of utopian and somewhat sort of divorced from everyday life. So throughout this project, we've been sort of arguing that we need sort of more shared visions that take account of much more diverse voices and everyday experiences. So the aim of the project was to just have a go at trying to create some of these visions of a public vision and to collect some sort of social intelligence, I guess, along the way of what public perceptions of more radical lifestyle changes might look like. So to do this, we conducted workshops in the UK, China, and Sweden to discuss with people what that change might look like in the 4 key lifestyle areas that Christina already mentioned. So we talked about what we eat, what we buy, how we travel, and how we heat our homes. In the UK, we conducted 6 workshops. So we did 2 each in Aberdeen, Manchester, and in the general southwest of England. It was a more rural sample. And we talked to people, tried to get a diverse section of society and talk to people with sort of a split between sort of higher and lower sort of carbon footprints and lifestyle expectations. So one of the challenges we faced was how to engage people with sort of the huge range of different strategies that are covered by all those topics. And we wanted to try and get people to think about trade-offs and what trade-offs would be needed between these different options if some were seen as too radical to implement. So to get this kind of huge amount of information across to people in a digestible way, we developed this set of low carbon lifestyle cards. I think there were 38 overall across all the topics. And this is an example you can see from the sharing economy. And it's sort of had a rating of how effective it would be at reducing emissions on the bottom with the star system. And then we used this, it's quite an academic thing, the avoid, shift, improve framework, but it was a good way of discussing these different approaches with the public. So we had some cards that focused on how to avoid emissions entirely, some that focused on shifting emissions, so accessing products and services in different ways, and then some that were about improving, which was actually basically improving the efficiency of products and services. So just very briefly on methods, we know it can be really tricky to get people to think about the future. So we had 2 kind of complementary future-oriented approaches. The first was quite a traditional deliberative approach. So we presented participants with the low carbon lifestyle cards for each area separately and discussed them as a group. And then we asked people to go away and reflect on that overnight and really think about, for them in their personal lives, their circumstances, which of these options would they choose, and what trade-offs would they personally make? And then we discussed this the following day. And then on day 2, we focused on a more creative, a much more fun approach to imagining the future. And we asked people in small groups we did a sort of detailed backcasting activity first, where we asked people to really imagine their location, their town, in what a 1.5-degree future might look like for them and their community. And then we asked people to discuss what had changed in the lifestyle areas, but also in society more widely. So thinking about infrastructure change, regulation, the social norms. And then following that, then the focus was then to get people to really imagine other people that lived in that future. So they were creating their own personas or characters to imagine what the lives of other ordinary people like them might be, or like them or their families. And then choosing another set of low carbon lifestyle cards that reflected those people's lives. So it's just a way for people to sort of get out of their own heads and their own circumstances, which can sort of restrict our opinions and values of what would be an acceptable change. Okay, so I can't really go into the card preferences data. We don't really have time for that, but we can always talk about that at the end if anyone's interested. But I will give you a little overview of the visions that people created. So although elements of the visions were different across the different locations, actually participants largely drew on the same kind of themes to describe their positive visions of the future. And to some extent, this even was the case across countries as well as within the sites in the UK. And so in the UK, the visions tended to be rooted in ideals of a sort of green and pleasant land, wanting to see much more improved local environments, better planning systems that worked for the community, increased green spaces, reducing pollution. And people generally felt that these things would bring co-benefits around air quality, healthier lifestyles, and a higher sense of local community. Then specifically on the 4 key lifestyle areas, regarding what we eat, actually food norms were already sort of seen to be shifting. And while very few people were willing to sort of personally consider being fully vegan, actually most participants were positive about a wider social shift towards plant-based diets, or sort of increased plant-based diets, if that makes sense. Other key elements included increased provision for local and seasonal food, significant reduction of food waste, which people always sort of see as a no-brainer, even though it's a tricky one to implement. They really want to see that for both individuals and businesses. And I guess underlying these choices was a strong desire for healthier, more balanced diets to be much easier and cheaper to maintain, and also for a greater focus on supporting local businesses, UK farming, these kinds of values. Then moving on to what we buy, participants here struggled a bit more to imagine how we could be different, and they sort of switched between there's no possibility for change and a kind of utopian future where we all sort of just voluntarily reduce our overconsumption. But practical steps in this area were seen to be the more sort of the less radical ones, around tighter business regulations, ensuring that all products meet high standards, have long lifetimes, product guarantees. There's increased product repairability and refurbishment. And participants, I guess, felt in this area that the idea of product service systems and a shift towards the circular economy were really the only long-term pathway towards low carbon consumption, but that perhaps this wasn't something that they as individuals or communities were really able to make a lot of change over. Then on the future of travel, desirable futures actually did centre on reducing car use, especially in urban areas, but obviously still without causing huge inconvenience or disadvantaging vulnerable groups. So people wanted to see increased green infrastructure and cycle lanes, particularly more around public transport. But despite this, actually continued car use still sort of remained an essential sort of central element of visions of a modern future, perhaps unsurprisingly. And people felt that individual ownership of small electric cars would be essential to allowing easy and accessible travel outside of the local area, which people aren't willing to give up. We also discussed air travel, and while reducing this was seen as something everyone would probably have to accept, actually people couldn't really see any positives of such a future. Frequent flyer taxes were reluctantly kind of seen as the fairest possible way to reduce emissions in the short term, but here we actually found quite a lot of hope for some technical solution for low carbon aviation that would allow us to sort of fully achieve emissions reductions without changing our behavior significantly. Then finally, on the future of heating, participants strongly believed that home refurbishment and building standards would be essential and wanted to see this. They saw the benefits of warmer homes, reduced energy costs, and they were particularly interested in smart technology and reducing energy use through social norms. So it wasn't entirely about a systemic approach. There was some elements of personal choice and change involved. But the overall focus here, I think, again, was that government leadership and provision of financial and technological systems were needed to make this a reality, and that it wasn't really a matter for individuals to be able to solve this problem, that this was more of a systemic change needed. Okay, so I don't have a lot of time. I won't reflect too much on the methods and things in general, but I guess just to say that our approach was definitely effective in helping people to imagine a more everyday low carbon future and to consider what the implications might be for their own lives. Interestingly, participants were definitely more able to see past their own reservations, their own circumstances and opinions, and sort of see some of the positivity and the desirability of radical change in the future, perhaps more than they had previously. So the first part of the analysis was to explore these desirable futures and what they look like. But the second was to look at how feasible these futures were seen to be. And what we found was that kind of in parallel to this sort of seemingly strong support for what could be deemed as quite radical change, actually there was this sort of underlying discourse of climate inaction and delay that was emerging and sort of limited participants' beliefs that those desirable futures were in fact possible. So this is an introduction to the concept. It's a kind of an academic thing, discourses of delay, but they can be understood as kind of a series of narratives and arguments that are used both purposefully and kind of unconsciously to justify inaction on climate change or delaying possible options. So far, mostly it's been studied in relation to policy and sort of media discourses and things that have been said by political actors. There's a particular, this is just a paper, probably the most famous paper, providing a typology of 4 key narratives. And these include kind of encouraging non-transformational change, which is moderate or gradual change that's sort of not as disruptive. Redirecting responsibility for actions to others so that we don't have to do anything right now. Emphasizing the downsides of climate action, and then also just stressing the idea that tackling climate change is impossible, sort of surrendering, we can't do anything. But there hasn't been much work on the extent to which these narratives are present in public understandings. And so this was the second part of our work. So we identified 4 overarching narratives of climate inaction within the data. They sort of partially overlap with the previous typology, but because they're coming from a different source and there's a focus on everyday life rather than kind of climate policy, the framings were significantly different. The table is just taken from our paper. I won't be going through all of them, don't worry, but there's lots of detail in there if you are interested. So the first of these overarching narratives was resisting personal responsibility. So this included narratives, you know, kind of arguments like what about China and the US, which sort of clearly draw on wider political or media discussions to argue that it's kind of futile for the UK to take any action if other countries aren't going to. But actually, this came in more commonly employed at a personal level. So with participants arguing, well, why should I sacrifice if my neighbours aren't going to? And there was this kind of frustration that people feel about perceived demands for individual action if they don't feel that everyone is working together. The second narrative was rejecting the need for urgency. So this kind of overlapped with the non-transformational change type in the typology, and there's sort of two ways that it emerged that are worth highlighting. So the first is around this idea that small actions are already enough, which actually kind of picks up on decades of environmental and media messages that tell us that if we all just do our little bit, then we'll get there. And these are messages that are actually intended to encourage climate action, but actually it shows that sometimes these can have a negative effect, as many participants were kind of arguing that the small and comparatively easy steps they were taking, often around recycling, you know, the traditional ones, switching off lights, these kinds of things, and sort of arguing that they justified other high carbon lifestyle choices when we know this isn't really the case. Then in contrast, there were sort of narratives around the idea of moderation is the only way. So this is clearly sort of more echoes political discourse, highlighting a belief that really the only way to achieve change in our society is through a kind of narrow band of moderate, gradual, often voluntary policies. The third narrative that emerged was around believing that change is impossible. So while these narratives did kind of reflect a sense that people are either unable or willing to change, there was none of this kind of belief that in sort of surrendering that climate action or that tackling climate change itself is not possible. But instead, these arguments kind of reflected our participants' beliefs about human nature. This occurred at a personal level, with lots of people kind of arguing like it's just part of who I am, that they don't really have the ability to change their habits and desires, and that's just something that about who they are. But also it appeared at a social level in a kind of much more judgmental way, where there was a lot of kind of arguing that other people are selfish and lazy, particularly often aimed at older people, older generations, or just generic sort of selfish others who can't see past their own self-interest and prevent change from happening. Then finally, the last overarching narrative was about defending the social contract as it was perceived to be. So these narratives were entirely based on the sense that climate action lies sort of currently outside of the existing social contract. It emerged in different ways. So sort of generally for our higher people with higher carbon footprints, often high incomes, there was kind of a narrative around I earned it, so I'll spend it. And it kind of reflected their sense that they felt they'd worked hard within the current social contract and they'd earned their money and their high carbon lifestyles. Then in contrast, there was another argument made in some of our lower income groups around the idea that life is just hard enough. And it was basically sort of the opposite, where people were saying that they felt the current social contract was already failing them and that it was unfair to ask them to do any more when other people were benefiting from a system that they weren't. And these narratives were kind of underpinned by a strong sense that others don't appreciate the efforts that they're making, and that, again, transformational change is really outside of current social possibilities because of this. Okay, so just a few reflections, I guess. It's clear that these narratives were undermining the belief in a sort of positive, fair, sustainable future that we saw when we were doing the visioning work. But it leaves a lot of questions, I guess, about where they're coming from and how they actually undermine support for climate action. In terms of where they originate, I think it's quite complicated. It's not really possible to fully disentangle. Some of them are coming from media, political discourse. You sort of see popular political actors and the sort of things they're saying sort of emerging through public understandings, particularly around sort of what about China argument, which is often linked to sort of commentary from sort of anti-net zero and populist actors. But also the entrenched narratives around sort of the myth of sustainability, that small actions aren't going to be enough, and that just changing your light bulbs and recycling a bit is going to make a difference, when we know that these generally have very low emissions reductions potential, is really baked into public understanding. Beyond this, I think the origins of the other narratives are much more diffuse, and they emerge through sort of general understandings about climate change from sort of 40 years of discussion, particularly around sort of what sustainable development means and technological optimism and progress. And then also from shared social values. So we know things like fairness, trust, shared responsibility. These values are really dominant in public opinion on climate change and action and energy systems change more widely. And you can see how they've influenced some of the different narratives. Then in terms of how they're influencing public support on climate action, we're hoping to do some more work on this at some point, but based on the findings so far, one of the key aspects seemed to be sort of the emotional sort of resonance that these narratives held for people. So there were sort of 3 ways that these were linked with participants' emotional responses. And often the narratives kind of emerged in clusters. And that was sort of connected to these 3 emotional responses. So the first was around sort of overconfidence in current actions and this sort of illusion of control and misplaced confidence in the small things that people are already doing. The second was defensiveness over radical change, which kind of perpetuated this sense that only gradual change was possible or fair. And the last one was dejection at the sort of scale of the challenge. And together, it's not really possible. I guess it's not really possible to say if the narratives cause the emotions or vice versa. I think it's probably quite closely intertwined. But it's clear that they kind of provided a sort of defense mechanism to participants, a sort of sense of security that reduced their concerns about the sort of existential threat of climate change, perhaps, or the possible threat that they might have perceived from the idea of these radical actions and the impacts they might have on their current lifestyles. And the outcome of all this is that it kind of limited individual or shared sense of agency surrounding climate action, which I think is really what we need to address if we want to sort of increase sort of more active support for climate action and different net zero policies. So I will leave it there. I think Christina's going to briefly wrap up, and then we're very happy to take any questions after that.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. Yeah, just a slide and some thoughts on what we can do to tackle discourses of delay or narratives of inaction, and kind of where we're interested in taking the research further. And if you've got any thoughts on this as well, we'd be interested to hear more. I mean, as Catherine already said, we already know, but these kind of narratives confirm that what's limiting people's kind of not just their own kind of behavior, because it's hard to do lots of these things for other systemic reasons, but also more generally this belief that we can do it is kind of a lack of trust in others and lack of individual and collective agency, which can leave people a bit defensive and dejected. So what can we do kind of to counter some of that? One of the things that we're thinking of doing, well, what we're thinking about doing is a little bit about the role of different organizations in, for example, governments in countering some of these narratives, but also their role, or different organizations and role models in creating these narratives in the first place, and thinking about what other narratives exist or emerge out there, both negative and positive. Obviously, we've done our analysis on the UK sample, so we're interested in how they might differ across countries and cultures. We think some of them are going to probably translate in a slightly different context. but there might also be new ones or different ones. And then obviously this question that I've highlighted here is how can we tackle narratives of inaction, and how can we improve this kind of trust and agency, or lack of trust and lack of agency, that comes across in some of these narratives. And elsewhere in our work, we think about public engagement quite a lot, and we think this is also really important in terms of tackling narratives of inaction. So obviously there's a role for communication approaches here, and in terms of entrenching these narratives, but also providing counter narratives, creating hope rather than kind of dejection, and kind of this collective agency that we might feel, and kind of correcting misperceptions within that as well. And we had a previous kind of webinar on this where it was mostly about misperceptions. Some of them might be actively driven by actors, but also that we know that people, for example, don't realize how much others care about climate change and what they're doing to tackle climate change. So there's a role for communication approaches in that sense, but we're also really interested in approaches that go beyond just one-way communication and beyond just communication generally, and thinking about public engagement in more participatory way, involving people in decision making, community action, and thinking about that across scale. So what might that look like at community scale, or what might a national public participation strategy look like to kind of build collaboration, cooperation, and kind of the sense of that we're all in this together. I know in the UK, for example, that there's a policy team putting together public participation strategy. So we're really interested in feeding into that and making sure that it provides some of that hope and collective action that I think we need to counter some of these narratives. And I think that's it for us. So thank you very much for having us.